them that believed in a resurrection, but they had the wrong perspective. You know, if I would paint a picture in your mind, well, I'm going to paint this picture in your mind. Paint a picture of a bird on it's springtime, and this bird is on a tree limb. And it's looking down, and as it looks down on the ground, it sees a fox. And the fox is singing. Now I want to ask you, what is the fox singing? What do you see in your mind? What is happening in that picture? Now, a lot of people would say, well, the fox is ready for food, isn't he? The fox looks up, sees a bird, and the fox is hungry. But because you didn't know the whole story, there had been a famine in the land, and the birds had this food that they would drop down from the trees, and so the fox was singing how lovely the bird is because it wanted the food that the bird had, not the bird itself. In many ways the same way. The Jews, they had some of the truth, they had part of the story, but God was unfolding His plan of redemption since the beginning of time. And the Jews had been looking for some sort of a political leader, a political master, a political person that would come along and save them from the Roman Empire, didn't they? We see that especially in the Gospels, that they missed Christ because they didn't have the whole picture. They looked at Christ, they saw His miracles, they saw things, and they just credited it to Satan. Remember, there was a time when they credited His works to Satan. He said, well, how can the house be divided against himself? But there's a resurrection focus because Paul is trying to make an issue of the resurrection. The resurrection, properly understood, is the culmination of God's plan of redemption since the beginning of time. It is consistent with the law of Moses, with the prophets, and everything else gone before it. If you look what it says, he said in verse 5, he said that if they are willing to testify, that people really know that our party, namely the religion of the Pharisees, which is, he claims to be part of the Christian religion if it's truly understood, has hope in the promises made by God to the fathers. And what was the promises that were made? That God was building His people. That God was orchestrating this whole plan and all the events from the Exodus out of Egypt to the coming into the Promised Land, to the building of the David's kingdom, to the rebuilding of the huts of David. All of these things were the promises, and the hope was that someday that Christ would actually rule and reign in a physical sort of sense. But what they didn't understand was that there was a coming of Christ, that He was going to die and He was going to be resurrected, and that was the centerpiece of God's plan of redemption. They were thinking something else. And they're saying, why is Paul on trial? Paul's saying, I'm on trial today because I make an issue of the resurrection. I make an issue that all the promises about God in Christ or about the Messiah hinge on the resurrection of Christ, that Christ actually fulfilled those promises. You can look in verses 6, 7, you see the word hope mentioned 3 times. It says, to which our 12 tribes hope to attain as they earnestly worship day and night. For this hope I am accused by Jews, O king. Why, he says in verse 8, why is it, though thought incredible by any of you, that God raises the dead? Now he's saying this mainly to King Agrippa. Remember, King Agrippa was the grandson of Herod the Great. Herod the Great, issued the order for the babies to be killed. His son issued the order for John the Baptist's head to be cut off. And it would have been probable that he would have been the governor of this area if he hadn't been so young at the time of his father's death. Again, I'm not going to go through the family tree of the Herods here, especially these Herods, but if you look at this, Paul is saying that the hope that we believed in, the hope that the prophets believed in, the hope that Moses believed in. You can even look down in verse 22. But he is saying to the people that I have said nothing except what the prophets and Moses said would come to pass. And he makes an issue of the resurrection. I remember sitting in my dorm room some 20, almost 25 years ago, and saying to myself that my faith ultimately hinged on the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Is God who He says He is, or is He not? Is Christ who He says He is, or not? And He's saying, why is it impossible for you to believe that the God who created everything out of nothing can raise something that is dead to life? Which is harder, to raise something that is dead to life, or raise something that doesn't exist into existence? Which is harder? Paul is assuming that you believe that what is harder is creating something that doesn't exist into existence. And he's saying, listen, my view of all of life and all of the world, that God is the one who created all of this we see, and it is nothing for God who created everything to raise someone from dead to life. That Jesus actually did raise from dead to life. And then he talks about how he opposed this idea. See, the resurrection makes us adjust our life. The Jews, if they really believed in the resurrection, would understand that if you're going to continue to be a true Jew today, you become a Christian because that is Judaism in its perfect and final and ultimate sense. See, God has been working things out. And a lot of people struggle with, how do I understand what happened in the Old Testament with the prophets? Sometimes the Bible talks about a general category, and it talks about it like we would say, the President of the United States did this. But sometimes we use the particular or the referent. We say, President Obama did this. Or if we could go back in history, we could say President Nixon did this, or President Reagan did this, or President Carter did this. Those are specific reference. But it all comes back to the idea that there is a President of the United States. Sometimes the Bible talks about, and when he's talking about the resurrection, he's talking about how God is building His kingdom. He's talking about the Old Testament people in the nation of Israel. And he uses that as a reference, saying the physical nation of Israel. But sometimes he uses the nation of Israel as a referent, meaning, or a general category, which we are the people of God today as the church. That God is, in this plan of God, the resurrection becomes central and crucial to Paul's defense and the idea of loyalty. Would you be loyal to a God that didn't exist? People do that today. People are loyal. People are committed. And I guarantee you today, you are committed to something. Paul was committed to something. He was committed to the extermination of Christianity. It says in verses 10 and 11, he says, and I did so in Jerusalem. Not only did I lock up many of the saints in prison after receiving authority from the chief priest, but when they were put to death, I cast my vote against them. See, the Jews broke Roman law by putting Christians to death because they didn't have the authority to do that. But Paul was saying there that this was happening. There was a resurrection focus in his defense. What is the focus of our lives? What is the commitments you have in your life? See, Paul opens up his defense and saying, let me tell you what's most important to me. Let me tell you what's most important, because the resurrection of Christ is the fulfillment of all that happened in the Old Testament. And I didn't have the big picture. I didn't understand it. I thought that Christ was this new sect, this new idea, this new thing that had nothing to do with Jerusalem, but I was sent out to destroy it, and now I understand that God had been working all along through this servant, Jesus Christ. And see, Paul says, this is what I'm committed to. And for this reason, I'm being tried today. I am being tried because I believe, he says, in the resurrection of Christ. He says, why is it incredible do you believe this? Now, of course, Romans